Hey, John, good to see you again. I hope I'm not too caffeinated as well. For everybody on the call, thank you for joining us today. I'm Dan O'Keefe. I head up content strategy and analytics here at Tongal. Tongal is a studio on demand, a community of over 200,000 creators around the world who do everything from social creative to full length features. And I'm super excited to talk with John today because we operate in a data deprived environment. We don't own anything we create. So this is super applicable to what we do on a day in, day out basis. Before Tongal, I was over in the TLD world. For those of you who don't know what TLDs are, it's .com, heading up marketing for a company called Minds and Machines. And then prior to that, I was with Demand Media, helping to build their branded content studio. And before that, Yahoo, where this really comes full circle because I helped to build the ad network, the SSP and the DSP. So a little bit about me. John, if you don't mind introducing yourself since we've met before.
Sure. So I'm John Roman. I sit as the Senior Director of Marketing Technology over at Chime. Before that, I was over at a number of companies that you all may recognize, hopefully. Had a brief stint at SiriusXM for a few months before I was taken over to Chime. Couldn't resist the opportunity as much as that was a great business as well. And then before that, Electronic Arts and Ancestry.com. And then I got my start agency side. So working under, at least 40 plus different brands over the span of my agency career, kind of navigating this shift in the availability of data and the use of marketing technology throughout the ages as things continued to evolve and change, as programmatic became a big thing, as we shifted, more from web to mobile environments and dealing with all the changes, tracking and measurement of that. And then of course, all of the data privacy legislation, all of the changes from, Apple from an iOS perspective that kind of change the way marketers are able to market and marketing analytics folk are able to measure. So really excited to be here today to talk about this specific topic.
Awesome. And John, I mean, your career path obviously lends itself as a full arc through the changes of data. So, to start with from your start, from the ad op side to where you are now working with Chime, from I think back about a decade ago where we had a free flowing, there was free flowing data. Now we're talking about CCPA and GDPR. How has your ideology in terms of data use changed?
Yeah, it's really become, it went from something that, we didn't have to put a lot of time and effort. I think about my earlier days in ad operations where everything was run through the ad server. We tagged all of our media content in our websites with like a million different pixels. We were able to do things like multi-touch attribution a lot more easily than we are today. We're able to do all this really cool stuff with dynamic creative optimization. And just over time, just reevaluating and thinking ahead has become extremely important to me. I never thought those many years ago that I would almost become like a partial lawyer or data privacy expert in terms of having to keep so aware of data privacy legislation and just what different big name tech providers in the space were doing in terms of creating that availability of data. So used to be just like, how are we executing from a technical perspective to really analyzing the state of data and looking ahead and seeing, what potential legislative measures may come in the future that we have to be aware of. Because sometimes when you're onboarding tech or you're building technology internally or in-house, incredibly expensive from either a resourcing or just a technology buying perspective. So it's not just about the moment when we're evaluating vendors now, it's thinking far ahead into the future and really working with partners that really understand the environment and have forward-thinking solutions to, tackle whatever's coming next down the pipeline. So I think that's been a really big shift over the years for sure.
Amazing. You talk about, you're not quite a lawyer yet, you don't know what you're working on within your degrees, but there's something in the news recently, I think, kind of jump into something that maybe people are aware of, you're thinking about, CCPA and, some of the first or the first company to actually have to pay out or to agree to pay out because of running afoul of CCPA. So for those who might not be aware of Sephora, so Sephora agreed to pay out $1.2 million because they had possibly failed to properly disclose to people who are selling data about them. And they possibly also failed to process those requests to opt out for the sale of the info. And that ran afoul of California's privacy law. so there was also issues possibly of ignoring issues or wishes of netizens who had signaled via global privacy control, supporting browsers or extensions that they didn't want their data sold. So, I keep using the word sold, and selling data is one thing, collecting data is different. To set the stage, can you help explain the difference?
Yeah, so that has been a point of contention since CCPA was first released, and luckily there's been a little bit more clarity over the years in terms of that portion of the CCPA legislation that talks towards the sale of data, right? Because I think if you think about it, if you hear that up front, you're thinking a tangible exchange, a monetary exchange. We're taking a subset of data, let's say like we own, and then we're finding a data broker or something like that, and they're giving you millions of dollars, and you're handing. That's not what the definition of sale of data means in this context. It could mean that, it could be the literal interpretation, but it's the broader definition that has been a point of contention and confusion for marketers over the years. And now that luckily that definition is slowly evolved, we're getting a little bit more clarity, but the big difference is this Sephora case because it set precedence. And that is something, when you're dealing from a legal standpoint, the law can sometimes be ambiguous, right? So you do your best to interpret it. You work with your legal and your data privacy teams to stand up kind of measures and actions and kind of defense mechanisms to protect the business. But at the end of the day, these sort of lawsuits are the things that kind of give everybody the next step, like, oh, why did they get in trouble for this, or what kind of got them into legal trouble? We need to get those details, and we need to cross-check what we've done previously with our interpretation of the law with anything that we may need to do additional that they got pinged for, right? So I think sale of data, just to go back to that, it can actually mean something much broader than that literal representation. It could mean, I think the word they use is valuable consideration. If you're working with a third-party service provider and there is an interpretation of the data you are providing them is enhancing a product or service or feature that they are providing you specifically, which is also a point of confusion, or their general piece of technology or their general service provision. That is something else it could mean. So I think in the Sephora piece specifically, there were a use of analytics and remarketing or retargeting platforms that actually got them into the hot seat. And where there's still a little bit of ambiguity is like a product or service or feature that is specifically helping your business versus the general piece of technology. I think there was a point in time previously where we all thought it was, oh, if we're sharing data with somebody, let's say like a Google, and we're only using that data to enhance our use of their platform, that should be fine. But now there's a little bit of contention there. So we're frequently like just reevaluating what that means, and then kind of deploying mechanisms to help. And I would recommend everybody kind of do that. If you don't have that do not sell button on your website today, talk to your legal teams, talk to your data privacy teams internally, just to make sure everybody is kind of speaking the same language. And then one thing I like to tell folk too is like, sometimes there may be things that happen from a legal perspective and you're like, oh, I'm over in marketing, doesn't really impact me. Sometimes these things impact the entirety of the business and you will see hits in your marketing numbers as well. So just having somebody or partnering with teams internally to make sure you're aware of what's going on and circumventing these issues before you are hit, let's say with a complaint, or you do get involved in a lawsuit, it's a good place to be in. Highly recommended.
It's great advice. I think, as you talk about, precedence being important, you're talking about all of the different teams or partners this might touch. How or why is precedence so important? And also, how do you look to your partners to interpret, this type of a first?
Yeah. So precedence, like I mentioned previously, it like sets the tone, right? We have our own interpretation, but until somebody gets sued, sometimes there may be like things that are a little more ambiguous that are at that point more directly kind of stated in terms of things that you can or cannot do. So taking that back, reevaluating what you were doing previously based off the interpretation of your law, and definitely working with your data privacy and legal partners. I will say they will have their own interpretations, and then they'll use these precedences to kind of come back. Let's say if you're sitting within a marketing org or a marketing technology org or a marketing analytics org and say, hey, we may need to shut all this stuff off if, let's say, a consumer clicks that do not sell my data button, or they opt out of any of these kind of tracking mechanisms. But sometimes it's warranting of a conversation, right? Make sure that they're understanding completely what you're doing with that data. And then there are certain contract types that also help you avoid the need to kind of shut down certain mechanisms if a user opts out of, let's say, like, do not sell my data. So also a very good moment to talk with them. You may have to go back out to your vendors, amend languages in the contract to some degree. That's also another way to protect the business. But forming those really tight-knit partnerships with your legal and your data privacy teams are incredibly important. I know sometimes people fear those teams. They may think of them as like inhibitors to innovation, or you want to go. In marketing, it's always fast. You want to move fast. You want to capture a moment in time that's happening, especially if you're dealing with like meme trends or social environments. But at the end of the day, you really want to make sure that you're doing everything within the confines of the law to avoid larger business implications. Because if you think about it, it may be something that, let's say, your marketing analytics might have caused this issue. Overall, it's going to impact the larger business, and that's going to impact everybody. And a lot of people are going to be asking questions. So, and then I would say also with those teams, educating, right? It's a little bit of an extra step that you need to take to educate your partners. But I've run into situations before with legal providers internally that they see, the Sephora case is actually a good example of why, marketing should be pulled into the room, and there should be a conversation about consent management, opt-outs, things like that. Data deletion is another good one. But in other cases, you may want to, let's see, how do I phrase this? Oh, you want to get behind the gun, educate your partners of how you're leveraging data today before they come to you asking. I've had examples where there may be something that comes out about, let's say, like Facebook or Meta, that has nothing to do with marketing. There may have been like a data leak of sorts. Like, there was that political thing that happened, Cambridge Analytica years ago, where there was I guess that kind of teeters into the marketing realm, but because of the misunderstanding of, legal partners I was working with in that environment at the time, there were all these fire alarms raised. We were asked to stop working with Facebook altogether, and there was a lot of kind of high impact education in the moment. It was very frantic just to try to calm down legal partners to be like, hey, that's not how we're using data. Here's how we're doing consent management today. This is the actual use of the data. This is how we're sending it. So it's always nice to educate your providers before those moments happen. So that way they'll be calm, cool, and collected. They'll know who to go to internally instead of pulling in a number of different people frantically to find out all the answers. So I've always made a big impact whenever I enter into a new organization to set up time with those folk, and then started creating councils internally to meet with our data privacy and our legal teams just to let them know what's going on. And then if they have any questions, they have kind of that sanctioned space to come to us to be like, hey, we heard about this thing. Is it something we need to be worried about? And we'll be like, yes or no, or here's what we already do that, we're protecting the business from this. So create those relationships, and then also get your teams acclimated to just like understanding, on the other side, right? I'll take a little bit of a step back. So we sit in a marketing technology organization that sits in between all of our marketing channels and then all of our more technical channels. So like our data engineering group, our legal, data privacy partners, procurement. Education goes both ways too. You want to go to your marketers and let them know the implications of, this new data privacy legislation is coming out. Here's how it's going to impact your ability to target users. Here's how these pieces of technology that you're paying maybe millions and millions of dollars for are going to be impacted by this lack of data or the death of the cookie or, things like ITP. So those relationships and those councils and those educational sessions and creating those moments for folk to come to you and ask you those questions is really important. And then educating your own teams. So I always make sure my teams are aware of data privacy legislation. They may be really focused on the technology, but that impacts what we do, as well as browser or environmental changes. So they kind of go into these conversations with different providers, asking the right questions. And that's one final thing I'll say, and then I'll shut up about this question. Your vendors should be coming to you when these things happen. This is something that I'm very critical on vendor relationships with. I never want to have to go to a vendor and ask, especially one that deals with a lot of data. If you think about let's say like a DSP or an analytics platform or a targeting platform, I don't want to be the first one to come to you to be like, hey, so we're hearing about all of these changes that are coming about in our way that we're able to use data. How is this going to impact your platform? I love it when vendors are proactive. They're obviously up to date with what's happening in the ecosystem in the space, and they come to you and say, hey, here's what's happening, here's how it's going to impact your use of this platform, and here's what we're going to do to try to circumvent this in the future. Even if they don't have a solution at that time, really important from a vendor relationship standpoint.
All great advice. I think setting up the councils is something that people should really think about, bringing cross-functional teams. But you brought up Cambridge Analytica, and to me, that was maybe when customer demand for privacy, transparency, and control of data really entered the zeitgeist. Along with the pressure of regulatory compliance, disrupting marketers' access to granular customer data to generate relevant insight. I've heard horror stories about how opt-outs on websites and apps have impacted measurement. So what do marketers need to be aware of to avoid these measurement horror stories? And how do you avoid them at Chime?
Yeah, really leading into that consent management framework. So we're having a lot of conversations right now about, I will say, setting up those mechanisms, but then I think there's also warrant in like talking to your media partners and saying, like, when we turn these things on and people have the ability to opt out, here's how it may impact your activation or your measurement. So just be prepared for that. And then working with those teams to really analyze the data, marketing analytics as well. Some teams, they don't have a separate marketing analytics, you would hope so, but any analytics providers internally or teams internally to assess the impact of these internal mechanism changes and then these environmental changes, things like ITP and some of the other iOS changes that are happening out there. To gauge the impact to the business and how they're measuring. And then I would also say, like, working with marketers to better understand how they should be measuring in the new age of measurement. I've come into organizations before where the teams were very much still operating and trying to measure for success in a way that worked in 2013. So it was very challenging trying to get them to understand why their numbers were not as good, why they couldn't do things like multi-touch attribution anymore, why certain things like DMPs were not as effective as they used to be. So going back to that educational piece, working with those teams, it's a nice trifecta of like your marketing analytics folk, your marketers, and then your MarTech, or if you have anybody internally that kind of manages your tools and technologies from a consolidated perspective, to sit down and really reinvent how you are measuring your marketing success and setting realistic expectations. And then making sure you're also educating your leadership to be like, hey, you may have seen a drastic drop in numbers, or we're not providing granular details from an analytics perspective of campaign performance and success or attribution. And here's why. And it's not necessarily an us problem. It is an industry challenge. And everybody's still trying to figure it out and learn as we go. And then also testing into new providers that circumvent those challenges, right? Like the stack has changed tremendously over the years. There's been a lot of consolidation of providers. There's been a lot of shifts away from technologies and platforms that were incredibly reliant on third-party cookies to function. Some of those companies shut down with GDPR legislation, unfortunately, it's stuff like that. So just making sure there's that always be testing, right? Like testing into new providers to circumvent these challenges, asking vendors the right questions. But yeah, it's just like a new age, and then continuing to have those conversations. So there's never a moment where anybody's out of the loop in terms of, it should be a unified front in an effort, I think, from a marketing perspective, for sure.
Always love a unified front. As we're talking directly still in like the marketing and the measurement and the attribution, how will you measure and attribute and optimize now in a privacy safe ecosystem?
Yeah, I think attribution is something, that has continued to be a challenge, at least like from a multi-touch perspective. Some people say it's completely dead. I think there are areas where you can do like data modeling to bridge the gap between like hard set data points of your consumer journey that may be lost now with fragmented ecosystems and environments. And sometimes you don't have that ability to track cross environment or cross platform. And we have a lot of these walled gardens that are really holding on to their data. So going back to my ad ops days, right, when we were able to pixel all of our media with like an attribution provider pixel. And we were able to measure when they saw a Facebook impression, and then when they were served a programmatic ad, and then tie that back to something like email messages if they were already a captured consumer and we had that information on hand. And we're able to do that multi-touch attribution and really say, like, here's how something like programmatic display is helping, even if it's not driving that last touch, right? Programmatic display has been so challenging for a lot of organizations to navigate, just because it doesn't tend to be necessarily a last touch driver in a lot of cases. It tends to be more of a mid-funnel mover. So I think that's where things like incrementality now are becoming more and more important. I'm sure, those of you on the call are probably sick of hearing about incrementality, but it really is a surefire way to, understand if when you're entering into a new channel or you're trying out something new like programmatic display, like having the ability to turn that on and off to gauge the overall impact to the business, just to see if it does do something, even if it's not driving those last touch points or those last click conversions. So I think that's really important to have that solidified strategy. And then I think MMM is still in a pretty good place. So we talk about like MMM and MTA. Whereas MTA will continue to be a challenge, that's going to be an ongoing conversation. MMM is something that's still pretty solid. So if you want to look and understand like your media mix and what makes the most sense to include and how you should be aligning budgets, there's a way to test the effectiveness of MMM as well that you can do. Look at the variance of if what they're reporting out versus what is happening in reality. But for the most part, that's still a very good tool. So I think incrementality combined with a nice MMM model that's constantly evolving, something that accounts for something like seasonality or marketing shifts is really important, because again, incrementality can be a little iffy if there's something seasonally going on that artificially inflates the numbers. So it's nice to have a provider you're working with or a really well-seasoned, let's say like marketing analytics team that knows how to run that internally, to find that right mix and where you should be spending your media dollars and what is not effective, as we continue to navigate the attribution space and find those solutions that help bridge the gap, if that is ever possible. I'm hopeful that one day there'll be something, so we'll see.
There is hope out there. You talk about partners. So we're partners, we do a lot of creative together, but you're talking about a lot of this, how we're going to attribute, optimize, measure, but how do you find the right vendors? I mean, for people on the call, what do your best vendors do that keep your business?
Yeah, to keep our business, proactivity, that's what I was talking about. We want real partnerships. We want vendors that are proactive and coming to us with solutions, not that we're having to knock down the door and be like, what's all this stuff we're reading about, or the numbers are suddenly dropping, or we can't use this mechanism anymore, like what's going on. So really, really, really appreciate vendor relationships are becoming more and more important, just in terms of building out the longer term roadmap. So kind of coming in, not just providing a product or service, but then also being that partner, which I think benefits the vendor as well. You start building out longer term relationships. There's a level of trust between the organization and then the vendors, where you can continue to grow and expand that relationship. That might include additional products and services, or contract extensions or renewals and things like that. So that's always really good to do. And then from an evaluation standpoint, when we do RFIs and RFPs, there is a lot of questioning surrounding your ability to circumvent third-party cookie deprecation, for the ability to leverage model data, if there aren't necessarily enough data points to provide that product or service or feature just with, let's say, like first party, second party, or third party data inherent. And then just like partnerships and integrations are really important these days too, right? Like you have a lot of providers and a lot of walled gardens that like they'll open the doors a little bit with those sanctioned partnerships or those recommended partnerships where there is some sort of data sharing going on between platforms. It's no longer this open door policy where you can just track and measure everywhere, but rather you have to examine who are they integrated with, who do they have data sharing agreements with, where you can get a little bit more enhanced measurement across ecosystem. And that goes with creative providers as well. I think dynamic creative is something that has changed over the years. I remember the days of we would have like DCO providers, you would integrate their technology into the ad server, and then you could send those ads wherever you wanted and get that sense of dynamic. But it really has shifted into more what we're focusing on now is kind of user journeying and trying to create a cohesive message across environment, using something like a marketing automation or CRM platform to dictate like where are we serving messages to users at any given time, but you still don't have a lot of flexibility there. So it's something that, you need to sit down with your marketing teams, your marketing analytics folk, and really determine like, how are you enabling things like personalization in specific environments rather than in like a larger, broader ecosystem everywhere the consumer is going? And then when is the appropriate time to hit a consumer with messaging, and how does data and technology impact the ability to do that and then to measure that success? So always something, to think about when going into that realm.
I love that. And you talk about personalization, and I'm going to make it personal for myself and maybe shift gears a little bit to focus on the creative side as we talk about dynamic creative optimization. Together, Chime and Tongal partner to make some amazing content with creators in our community. How do the changes to data policies impact your approach to developing personalized creative?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where you definitely want to have consented data if you're doing any sort of personalization. That's after the Sephora thing, we all should have been doing that. But I think the Sephora case like re-rang a lot of alarms for organizations to really double check on how they're getting that consented data and activating that and leveraging it. Very important in explaining how you're leveraging that data to your consumers, right? Because I think I didn't touch about this before, but the impact to consumers saying, do not sell my data, they're automatically going to think of the literal interpretation. We're taking your data and we're selling it for money. We're giving it to some data broker, with a curly mustache and like a money bag and a top hat. And then we're getting, so that's one thing. It works to educate the consumer as well. So that way they understand that like the sharing of this data is going to give them a more customized experience. They're going to have a more personalized experience, both in controlled environments and then surrounding the advertising that they're served elsewhere. So they have something that's a little bit more catered to them. And I think that's a larger conversation for another time, but just like the communication with consumers and the exchange of free content and the need for them to share certain aspects of their data, their personas, I guess you could say, in order to fund a free and open internet. But then us as marketers or anybody like leveraging that data, how do you do it in a way that's not creepy? And I think that goes into creative too, right? You want to be personalized, but you don't want to be too personalized. There was in the last chat, I joined during a little early to listen in on the ending of that. Terrible short-term memory, so the names of those panelists are gone. But I do remember them mentioning something about, like you've been eating a lot of Doritos, maybe you need a larger shirt. Like that's a good example of like creepy personalization, right? Like, how'd you know I was eating all those Doritos? I do eat a lot of Doritos, but for me, it would also be Taco Bell that would lead to that sort of personalized advertising. Love me some Taco Bell. But I digress. So you want to find that thin layer where you're creating that personalized experience, but you're not putting too many specifics in that to the point where your consumer is kind of freaked out and distrusts you as a broker or user of that data or collector of that data. So educating the consumer means everything, and then making sure we avoid the creepy realm of personalization, which sometimes good intentions. Make sure you have multiple viewpoints in the room to gauge whether that's something you should or should not be doing.
Oh, absolutely. I think when I think of like the personalization element, the weather is something that you can always create around, whether it's warm and I need a t-shirt or it's cold and I need a sweater. That's a level of personalization I might accept. But if you're saying my t-shirt's too tight because of what I'm eating, I could totally understand how that might become very, very creepy very quickly.
Oh yeah. For sure.
And how do you communicate to customers? Then you talk about communicating how data is used to customers. Where does that sit in your organization, and how do you do it?
Yeah, I think like that goes into your consent management framework, and like really where you enable those controls for consumers to go in and really understand what they can opt out of or what they can opt into, depending on if you're working more in a GDPR sanctioned environment. I'm so happy I made the move to Chime. Fortunately, we don't have to worry too much about GDPR since we only operate in the US right now. But maybe one day GDPR will have to be a thing we think about. But it's really one of those things where you should have those areas that are easily to navigate to. It's clear and visible to the consumer where they need to go to toggle those switches on and off in terms of how their data is collected and used. And then the value proposition should also be stated there. let them know in plain clear language, what this is enabling from them. So you don't have to go too specific, but just if you talk about things like enablement of products or services or features, right? That's something that consumers should know. First off, hey, we may be collecting this specific set of data, but it's literally for this app or this tool or what you are trying to use as a product, service, or feature to work. And then you have your other subsets of data that are going to be more optional for consumer, for marketing purposes. And that's where we get into the whole Sephora piece and a lot of the contention with CCPA. It's like explaining to your customer, this is more for your personalized experience from both a on-site, maybe offers and recommendations that we're recommending to you internally, but then also to give you a little bit more of a personalized ad experience, which some people may care about that, some people may not, but they know they have the flexibility to turn things on and off. And they understand what that does when that switch is flipped, I think is very important. So also could be used as a testing mechanism in certain cases. I think, if marketing wants to get involved, this is also a great area for marketing to kind of lean in a little bit, how you are communicating that value proposition while working with legal to say, like, here's the language we absolutely need, but where do we have flexibility to change the wording around a little bit to maybe entice our consumers or try to get them to agree to leave their data collection on for marketing purposes, because this is the value that they will receive. So I think those are some things that are a good idea to do.
Absolutely. Educating consumers is definitely a positive. And, as we talk about educating the consumers on one side, I think, I go back to, a learning experience. I've learned so much as you're talking through this. How do you continue to educate yourself and stay on top of the data changes and the policies, and keep your teams up to date, and moreover, stay out of legal jeopardy?
Yeah, so it's great. So I would say internally, we talked about creating the councils and the opportunities for just relationship building with different parts of the organization and to share and communicate what's going on across everybody's realm. So that way we don't have these emergency moments. But other ways to supplement that, it's like doing things like this, having these sort of conversations, working with organizations like Brand Innovators, shameless plug for Brand Innovators. They do a lot of great closed door roundtable sessions where you can meet with other marketers and other organizations, from all sorts of different verticals, all different types of company sizes. So you can always kind of match up with somebody and then ask them those questions, there are certain things I think we all know. NDAs kind of drive things you can and can't talk about, but generalities, it's very valuable to see what other organizations are doing and how they're thinking, and then bringing that back to your own to maybe create some thought ideation internally and maybe revamp some of the things that you're doing. There's a lot of great resources online. I like to follow MarTech. They have a great conference and they have a great online presence and different articles. Scott Brinker is amazing. He's one of my idols. Is a very great thought leader in the space and talks about all sorts of different topics, inclusive of kind of data privacy regulation, the use of data, kind of all these changes happening within environments that are changing the way us as marketing technologists and marketers are able to leverage and use data for marketing purposes. So I think that's another great thing. And then one thing I will go back to the vendor analysis and stuff like that. And you make these great connections in these brand innovator events. You can kind of, if you're on the fence about using a specific provider, because sometimes, sales teams can be really amazing and right, like there's what is it called? Like the shiny object syndrome. Sometimes there may be a little overpromising and you don't have that technical expert in the room to really like ask those hard hitting questions or do a full scale evaluation. And you want to be sure your investment is really going to work for your business. Back channeling is something I love to do now. So you make the connections, you can reach out to other similar marketers in the space that you maybe in those conversations, you found out, hey, they are using this tool that we were considering evaluating. Going to them and being like, hey, we were considering this. How has your time been with this specific vendor or this agency or this provider? And I've gotten a lot of valuable experience with that, just finding out things are amazing and like, hey, full speed ahead. We're getting a lot of great things from folk, or in the reverse, like, yeah, we've been having some challenges, and then maybe bringing that into your evaluation and asking additional questions to circumvent that. So those are all ways I like to keep afloat of what's going on in the space for sure.
And is there like a specific timeline that you'd like to keep these evaluations ongoing? Is it a constant, you're always looking at vendors and looking at how proactive they are in the space, or is this something that really is kind of modeled out on a calendar year?
It's funny. there have been times where I've been very overly enthusiastic and I was like, we're going to do annual evaluations for all of our vendors. But then when you have 30 or 40 tools under the helm, it's a little hard to do 30 or 40 evaluations in a year's time. Considering some vendors, their contract period may end at around roughly the same period. So kind of adopted a model of like really assessing and speaking to, my team owns, let's say, a certain portion of the technology, but we also have users that sit cross-functionally, doing a little mini evaluation internally to be like, how has this been working for everybody? To indicate if there's a need to maybe move away from that platform or that vendor or that service provision. If everybody's like, no, it's been amazing, we have a great relationship, we have a longer term roadmap, we feel like these are partners, they're addressing all of these issues related to the loss of the cookie and data and all of this other stuff. Maybe we won't go through a full scale evaluation. It's more directed now towards those vendors that aren't keeping up with the change of times, right? Because at the end of the day, you have to validate the what you're paying for these products and these services and these features. Sometimes they can be millions of dollars, and there should be a clear understanding of how that's driving value to the business. If it's not from an incremental standpoint, then like how is it more of a necessary to keep the business running? That's also very important to explain to folks that are looking at those dollars and those budgets that we're leveraging for tech. So I think what was the original question again? I forgot it. I've been talking for such a long time.
Don't worry about it. I mean, we touch on so many things. We're really keeping up to date. Where do you?
Yeah, so that's the way we kind of look at evaluating our vendors and our relationships. And then I haven't even begun to talk about like build versus buy, right? Like I think there's a lot of ideology now around, are some of these things better to build in-house, especially if we're thinking about data privacy and how we're sanctioning our own use of first-party data. And my stance on that has always been like, we shouldn't arbitrarily try to build everything and anything we can in-house. There are certain values to going with kind of that mixed model of internalizing tools that maybe there is a higher risk related to data use and execution. And if it's something that's easy to build in-house and you have a team that's available to maintain that, you want to avoid, the one person may leave the organization and then the piece of tech that was built internally, nobody knows how to update it or integrate it at that point. So that's always a little bit of a risk. But then, like that could be tremendously valuable in certain circumstances. And then otherwise, there are thousands and thousands of third-party solutions now. Every day, something new comes out. So it's just always nice to have a mixed mindset in evaluating the right approach for your specific business. The growth stage of the business is also very important. And then how fast do you need to do something? Because you're always going to be able to typically integrate a third-party piece of tech with full capabilities faster than if you're building something from the ground up, unless your legal team takes months and months and months, which another conversation I love to talk about, how to shorten those timelines in terms of evaluations and then getting things through legal and finance and all that good stuff.
We'll look to our friends at Brand Innovators to set up that panel soon and go through all those things. So, before I open up the audience for any Q&A, I guess if anybody joined us late or you've given us a lot of great advice and information, give me how do we stay one step ahead? What's the best advice for marketers so that they do stay one step ahead?
Oh, that's a good one. If I only had to pick one,
it has to be one.
Yeah, I've almost to say you could just create a really good this is kind of a cheat because it involves multiple steps, but it is one thing. You can create a really solidified, customized feed of different marketing and tech related and data related news outlets. So that way, every day when you come into the office in the morning, just spend 10 or 15 minutes of your day scrolling through aggregated news headlines to keep on top of anything that you should be aware of. And then if it's pertinent, if it's something that sounds confusing or alarming, definitely read more into it. And then that's the starting stone of doing deep dives, reaching out to different people in your communities, talking to your legal experts, talking to your teams internally that may have a little bit of a better understanding of these topics that may impact your ability as a marketer to execute or measure success. But I think curated newsfeed is a great thing to have. Lots of people like to do that on Twitter. You can do a customized CSS feed. You can listen to podcasts. Just create that content that comes to you organically, that gives you a good view of what's happening in the space, I think is tremendously valuable. A little bit of work, but then after you get it running, it's smooth sailing from there.
Amazing. So I'll open up to the audience. Any questions, Jamie, from the Brand Innovator side? Anything that we want to touch on further?
Let me check the Q&A really quick. Nothing right now.
I answered everything. Anything.
Yes,
John,
covered everything. Yes, so thank you to you both for such an insightful and interesting conversation. Always a pleasure having you join us, John. And thank you again for taking time out of your busy schedules. We hope to have you back with us soon.
No problem. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.